Good evening, everybody. I did decide to go ahead and do the voiceover for these chapters because I don't want to go over every little detail in class. I want us to really try to go in depth so that we can understand exactly what all these concepts are to restorative justice, and also too to be able to go over some from last week. So we have actually a lot to do on Monday. So please try and spend some time on listening to this, and I'll try to just highlight and not necessarily make it too long for you. But before I begin, I wanted to mention something about shalom that I read that I really forgot to say in the other PowerPoint. And as I was talking about the concept, the pattern of thought of shalom, this really impacts uh, the change in thought that we look at with restorative justice. It refers not only to a state of peace and a state of mind, it refers to the physical well being, which to those believers includes adequate food, clothing, shelter, and wealth. And the wealth is not necessarily monetary. It's a right relationship between people and the acquisition of virtue, especially honesty and moral integrity. Just another thought to understanding shalom and how it really affects our pattern of thinking and our changes in our thought. Um, Also, too, and I think I did mention this in the last PowerPoint, but did want to mention it again. When we talk about restorative justice, we're not talking about the opposite of retribution or the lack of punishment. Some offenders are inherently dangerous and they have to be restrained. Someone must make that decision. Usually it is the judge, but with restorative justice, we're looking at a more of a collaboration with the offender, the victim, all of those harmed into what they believe the punishment should be. Usually that decision is guided by rules and careful safeguards. Some crimes are so heinous that they require special handling. These are not the normal offenders, and these are not what is filling up our prisons. So in those conditions, restorative justice may not work. So just to keep that in mind. Okay, and now we're going to talk about the encounter. And the encounter is really the most important part of the restorative justice process, and we're going to spend the most time talking about this. This is the face-to-face meeting. The victim has a right to face their offender. Now, remember, it is completely volunteer on both sides. Confrontation is the typical part of our current criminal justice system. Our typical system, however, does not call for direct confrontation or direct discussions between the victims and the offenders. That does not happen in our traditional system. The encounter gives the power back to the victim that the offender took away through the offending. In criminal justice, we turn normally the power of the decision making to the experts, like the judges, the counselors, the DA, law enforcement, legislatures. But with restorative justice, the victim gets the power back and the community. So the encounter can occur in a number of different ways. The best way is the face-to-face meetings. These do the most benefit for both participants. But a surrogate can be used if the victim does not want to attend or is not able to attend. And I think I mentioned that in the last presentation. Also, videos can be used, letters can be used. We'll see more, and we'll talk more about the surrogate process when we get into the types of encounters. The encounter provides empowerment. It's an exchange of information. Howard Zehr said that the empowerment is crucial to success and healing. The encounter will explore the facts, the feelings, and the resolutions. Howard Zare points out that even if there was no relationship before the offense, now there is a relationship. There's a forced relationship now between the victim and the offender, and usually it's a hostile relationship. This hostility, it's not beneficial to either the victim or the offender. So that is one of the elements that is under discussion within the encounter. Also remember that the encounter is not always positive. Um, and according to Howard Zare, may not even be possible. Maybe there's too much harm, too much pain. One of them might refuse. Um, Even during the encounter, the victim or the offender can stop the process. Now, the referrals for encounters can come from a number of sources. They can come from the courts, the community, even the victim or the offender or the families. They can call the courts. They can make a recommendation. They might make a suggestion. I'd like to have an encounter. What do you think about an encounter? What do you think about restorative justice? To resolve any wrongdoing, Ron Clausen, who is another advocate of restorative justice, a longtime one, he said that there's three things that must occur. Let me check this. Okay, not there yet. That three things must occur. The wrong, the injustice, or the harm must be acknowledged during the encounter. Equity needs to be restored, meaning that equality, because before the encounter, as I said, it's the offender that had the power. So we need to restore that back. So it's to give that power back to the victim. This can also be done through restitution or an apology. Now we're going to talk about apology really in depth, and I want to do some of this in class as well. The third one is the future intentions need to be addressed. That means what's going to happen after the encounter? Will the offender be able to restrain from further offenses? Um, how does everybody live together in the same community after this has occurred? And how do we move ahead with our life following the encounter, the amends, the reintegration? How does all that happen? So that's one thing that has to be discussed. Okay. Mediation. This is a part of the encounter, a sub-element, so to say. I prefer, as I think I've said before, it's not really a mediation, because to me, a mediation means that everybody's there on equal ground and everybody has the same rights, and that's not the case with an encounter. The victim is really the first one. The victim comes first. But victim offender conferencing is really a better term. This began in the 1970s, the mediation, with all encounters, and like I said, it's always voluntary on all parties. Both the victim and the offender always meet with the mediator or the facilitator before to individually agree on the plan for the meeting. And I said this before, they're not just thrown together. This facilitator will meet and make sure that both are prepared for what's going to happen and make sure they also both want to do it. The VOM allows offenders and victims the same opportunity to meet with the mediator, to agree on the steps that will happen. Now, with this type of encounter, it only includes the victim and the offender. No other parties are involved. The mediator or facilitator is trained to be neutral and to not make any suggestions. They're really there to just ensure the safety to the victim, which is paramount. This is planned from the beginning. It's a very structured environment. Apology and forgiveness. The encounter is more about resolution and not about forgiveness. We will talk more about this. It could be a result, but it's not required, it's not expected. The offender must accept responsibility. The strength of the VOM is in the structure. As like I said, it's a very structured process. It's the most structured of all the types of encounters. Everyone speaks in a certain order. It increases the satisfaction from both parties. and it will always end with a written plan for how the offender will fix the harm they have done. It's a signed agreement. Both parties will always agree to it, and the mediator facilitator will also sign as a witness. And a lot of times, what happens is this agreement will be sent back to the court. In some types of encounters in restorative justice, if referral came from the court, maybe even someone within the court made the recommendation, the offender agreed to it, the victim agreed to it. Well, the judge might recommend, okay, I want to hear what happens after the mediation, and I'm going to approve whatever the plan is before we proceed. So many times it will go back to the judge. The judge may or may not approve it, and then we'll move on. So how can an offender ever really make up for what they've done? Let's give the example. Say a theft. They stole from the victim. Typically, the agreement will then include a rule that says the offender will replace the item, or they'll pay for the item. They may also do something even beyond this, and that's very positive, especially if the offender offers to do something that the victim doesn't ask. For instance, the victim may have experienced even more loss besides just losing what was taken. They could have been out of work to have to go take care of it. Maybe it raised their insurance. So they may ask for more repayment than just a simple amount. And they may also ask for a bit more punishment for the offender than just repaying the victim. They might say, well, I don't want him just to pay me back. That's just equal. He needs to feel for this. He needs to make it up to me for what I've lost. And remember, it's all about restoring the harm. So victims might want the offender to complete therapy or community service or even time on probation. And as I said, it's going to go back to the judge for agreement. The offender can never really undo what they've done, but they can make strides to really make it as right as possible if they want to. The next type of encounter is the conferencing, or called family group conferencing. Now, this type of encounter began in New Zealand. It was based on a practice by the Maori people, and we'll be talking about them throughout this course. Remember from last week that this culture resides in New Zealand, and it is a communitarian society, community over individuality. This form is widely used with juveniles, but this society is really it's a model that many restorative justice programs will go back and reference. It is different from the VOMs in that structure. And remember how I said that the mediation VOMs are really the most structured. Facilitators, like with the VOMs, they will remain impartial, but they're also there to ensure the agreement is made, that it's realistic, and holds the offender accountable. It's not a mediation. It's facilitated. The VOMs, as I said, are much more restrictive than these conferencings. The conferences includes the community of care. That means as many as 12 people can attend. It'll include the family of both the victim and the offender. The participation of the family of the offender is really important. It helps offenders accept that responsibility and accountability. Law enforcement or other court officials may attend, just depending on the legality of the conference. Remember how I said, is this a recommendation from the judge or the court? So someone might be there to represent them. These, the mediation or the VOMs usually include only the victim and offenders, but these conferences, as I said, include a lot of other people, and also there's really no preparation beforehand, except to make sure that it's complete voluntary. As with the mediation, this also includes a written plan or agreement at the end, and the outcomes can be blocked if the agreement is not made. So that's important. It's the same as with the mediation. There has to be an agreement. The next type of mediation we're going to talk about are circles. Now, these are based on the peacemaking practices of the native North Americans. They have done sentencing circles for a long time. This is a very community-focused type of mediation. In other words, the crime is seen as an affront to the community as well. So members of the community will attend. It's a meeting of the entire community. It's more focused on discussion that involves everyone that attends, while conferences and the VOMs are usually and possibly court ordered. Circles are started at the request of the victim or the offender. In other words, after I want to do more, so let's have a circle. Let's involve everybody that's um, been harmed. And this is something I want to talk about in class. And now you don't have to watch that YouTube down there. We'll go over that. We'll watch that in class. I may have lifted it on Blackboard. I can't remember because I can't remember. It doesn't tell me what the title of it is. But a question that I want you to think about before class is, when you think about these circles and about what I just said, do you think that they do hold the offender accountable? Do you think the offender, why would an offender request this? Look at it from both sides. Just think about that, and we'll talk about that on Monday. The next type of mediation is impact panels. Now, this is where the surrogate really comes into effect, comes into play. A surrogate encounter. This is different from the victim impact statement that we will talk about later. Not all offenders are caught. And according to the FBI, in fact, less than 20% of all crimes result in an arrest. So, and pleas within the court system encompass 90% of all crimes that the DA accepts. So that's another statistic, but that's something that you've probably gone over in intro classes. Not every victim wants to participate in these. Also, if the offender does not accept responsibility or may refuse to participate, the community needs to step in and they'll play a role. It's called approximate justice, where the community listens and acknowledges the harm. A victim and facilitator, they might meet alone, and this is called a restorative conversation. The victims can meet to just talk about the offense, especially if the offender is not known, if the offender refuses to participate. It's made up of a group, sometimes it's made up of a group of victims. I'm talking about the panels here. They're made up of a group of victims and offenders that are linked by maybe the common type of crime. It's not necessarily the same incident. And I know you've heard about these with MAD, where somebody that has maybe committed a DUI or as an offender under the influence might go and answer questions of mothers whose children are victims of drunk driving. But it still helps the victims find resolution. It helps the offenders understand the harm they've done. To hear from victims of what has happened. And these impact panels too, they also happen a lot of times within prisons, where victims will come and talk to the prisoners and tell them how they felt over being violated. And this will help the offenders to understand what the victim went through and accept responsibility. MAD, for instance, uses panels, and also the Sycamore Tree Project uses panels. And I'm going to talk about those two right now as well. MAD includes no interaction between the victim and the offenders. The victims might speak and the offenders are on the panel. A victim will speak to a group of offenders who have a DUI or related offense. Usually they're ordered to attend by a judge. And now this is different than the mediation, where it's a voluntary participation. Do you think about this? Do you think this could cause shame? They're ordered to attend, just something to think about. Victims are chosen to attend, but they will not necessarily, they must not blame or accuse offenders when they go. They're there, it's more of an information contribution and exchange. Yeah, we're not going to watch that video. The Sycamore Tree Project, it's a prison restorative justice program. It's run by the Prison Fellowship Organization. And if you haven't looked at their website, I'm pretty sure it's in your book. I strongly encourage you to look at that. 5 to 6 victims will lead classes with offenders in prison. Classes are scripted and they include responsibility, confession, restitution, and forgiveness. At the end, all participants write letters to their victims or offenders. Now they're not delivered, they're not mailed. It's just a task, and it's because they cannot contact their victim without the victim's permission. These letters can lead to meetings between the victims and the offenders later on, meaning that they do write their letter and say the victim agrees to receive it, then it could lead to something later on. This is an alternative to a face-to-face encounter when that's not possible. So this is all underneath that surrogate. Now, I just want to summarize the more important elements of the encounters. Some of these we've already talked about, but the meeting where they talk to each other, the narrative where they describe what happened to them, the encounter includes showing emotions that can help foster healing. The meeting and the narrative and the emotions will lead to understanding, not forgiveness. Now we're going to talk about that later. Again, as I said, it can happen, but it doesn't always lead to forgiveness. But it leads to empathy for both. Um, it includes the agreement to the resolution or restitution. How will the offender fix the situation? And some examples of the encounters, the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program by Mark Umbret. He conducts that in California. Also, the Restorative Justice Consortium identifies several key principles for victim treatment and restorative processes. For example, respect for their personal experiences, needs, and feelings, the acknowledgement of their harm or loss, recognition of their claim for amends, and the opportunity to communicate with the person who caused the harm or the loss, if the person is willing. So those would be the face-to-face. The recognition as the primary beneficiary of reparation. Let's continue. There are also some issues that we have to focus, issues that we need to address that need to be recognized whenever you're dealing with an encounter. um, Want to work on minimizing coercion? Does the promise of a more lenient punishment or dropping the charges coerce the offender into participating? As I said, it must be voluntary, but how do we ensure this? Because, as I said, the recommendation can come from a number of different sources. If the court makes a recommendation, or it's brought up within the court, hey, offender, how do you feel about going to a mediation with your victim? And there might be some kind of incentive. If you do this and there's an agreement made, we'll talk about alternatives to punishment. So are they thinking now, okay, I'm going to do this? So what do you think about that? Also, who do you include in the encounter? Just the victim and the offender, which is the mediation? Do you have more supporters and have a conference? Do you use the community and the court members and have a circle? The accountability for conduct and outcome of the encounters can be considered in court or with probation. So, as I said, these are all issues that just have to be addressed when dealing with any encounter before they move on. So the next part of the restorative justice is we're going to talk about the amends. Now these next three, are not as long, so I promise I won't spend as much time on them. But what is amends? Remember, it does not undo the past. It doesn't undo what's already happened. The crime creates needs or obligations. So the victim needs to speak their feelings, their truth, and talk about their truth and how they feel over and over again. They want others to suffer with them and acknowledge their pain. By telling the offender what happens to them is reducing their own responsibility. It increases further irresponsibility and lets them off the hook. Now, I'm talking about the victim here. As I said, it does not undo the past. It takes steps to repair the harm. It does not happen automatically. It doesn't happen quickly. It may happen during the encounter, but it may happen after. There are 4 elements to the amends that we're going to talk about: the apology, changed behavior, restitution, and generosity. The first is the apology. This is very important that you understand what we mean by apology. It includes an acknowledgement of the harm that the offender did. They assume responsibility. They may be a little reluctant to do this, and sometimes don't want to do it. Punishment is actually easier. They don't have to accept accountability. They can just be punished and say, oh, well, just give me my time and I'll be out. They have to really admit that what they did was wrong and that they did it and that they did cause the harm. They have to show affect and empathy. They have to show some type of remorse. That you have to show that it really bothers them that they caused this harm. It's not just saying, hey, I'm sorry, let's move on. That is not at all what is meant here by an apology. They have to show vulnerability. The wrongdoer is now the powerless one. This is what's going to bring the equity to the victim. They have to really show, I'm the one that caused this harm. I'm responsible. You're not. It is an exchange of shame and power between the offender and the offended. I just think that's such a powerful statement. It's an exchange of shame and power. The victim goes into this feeling powerless, feeling shameful, and now we're going to turn that around and make the offender shameful and powerless. The next part of the amends is the changed behavior. Another way to make amends is for the offender to change his or her behavior. So it happens if they're not incarcerated. And what we mean by changing their behavior, they're changing their values and how they look at what they did, at what they caused. It's showing a changing in behavior. So maybe they committed this crime because of the people they hung out with. Maybe it was their peers, the corner they stood on. They were egged on by their friends, by the gang members, or by their acquaintances. Well, by staying away from those people and getting a job, working with the community, they need to really show that they are a changed person. And the third part is the restitution. This is where they are making the wrong right again. They are obligated to do this, and they should feel that obligation. This is a formal way of holding the offender accountable, either through the encounter agreement or on their own to recompensate the victim. They may not be ordered to recompensate the victim, but they might decide to do it on their own. This type of restitution, this type of accountability, it's really been taking place for centuries. We talked about it in the last PowerPoint. The types of restitution could be replacing property, paying back the victim. It could be performing a direct service for the victim. Now let's move to the last one, the fourth one. I think I said restitution was, but there's 4. Okay. Generosity. This is really going beyond the demands of justice and equity. It includes anything that the offender agrees to do that goes above and beyond the simple repayment. And I really went into this a little bit more a few minutes ago. But maybe the offender wants to just repay the community and may do it with community service. It really shows commitment to repairing the harm. And it adds again to that changed behavior. They are doing more than just required of them. They're really showing their uh, their changed values. They're really showing their commitment to making the harm better. And again, we've got some issues that we have to address. Again, who should receive the restitution? Should it be the victim, the family, the community? What type of crime was it that in the I don't want to go there right now. We'll talk about I'll mention that later. The primary victims, there's also secondary victims. So when they are deciding restitution, how do you decide that? Should it reflect the seriousness of the offense? How can you really quantify the amount to repaid for serious crime victims? We're going to see a video later on where there's a victim and she was just brutally injured, and she participates in restorative justice with the offenders, and her whole life has changed because of the physical attack on her. So how, if they wanted to, how do they repay that? They can never give her back her full capabilities. So how do we measure that? For which injuries should it be provided? What types of crimes should we consider restitution, generosity, restorative justice? Is it ever not feasible to do restorative justice? For instance, if they're incarcerated or there's just not the means to make it happen. What if the offender's in prison and can't repay the victims? What if the offender's never identified? Are there other ways the offender can pay? Offenders take responsibility and they take action to repair the harm they caused, but not told what they have to do. All questions we need to ask. And now we're going to move to reintegration. The elements of reintegration that work together to help the offender and the victim re-enter society as productive members of society. We have to think about safety, respect for dignity and worth, practical and material help, moral and spiritual guidance and care. And when we talk about reintegration, what do we mean? How do we define reintegration? We're talking about this for both the victims and the offenders. Both of them have to be reintegrated back into their life. Victims many times are scared to leave their home. They don't want to go back into the community. Maybe the community blames them for being a victim. They feel unsafe. So they may have been in the hospital. They may be returning home. They may be returning to where the offense happened. So there's a lot more about reintegration than just what we immediately think of, and that's the offender returning home. It helps both the victims and the offenders transform themselves and removes any stigma applied to them from the event. And notice I didn't say crime, but event. The reintegration works to help both re-enter their communities as whole, productive, and contributing members. The four elements apply to both victims and offenders, and now we're going to see how. Reintegration in victims is addressed during the encounter, the face-to-face. Safety is priority. Many victims may still have a fear of the offender. They not only fear the offender, but they can develop new fears from the offense. So the reintegration really the focus is for the offender. The focus for victims is they could feel isolation, they could feel disoriented. Crisis intervention for victims who experience depression and isolation. that can affect every aspect of their lives might be possible. They won't return to work or home. They're holed up in their homes, etc. Is is this the same for all? It involves referrals, availability, looking for as many services as possible, involves the community. They may have a negative self-identity. They could see themselves negatively, blame themselves, experience trauma. They could have fear of another crime. Others may blame them, as I said. The criminal justice system even adds more blame within the system. The defense attorneys add blame. They can come from just about anywhere. It doesn't stop when the crime is cleaned up or over, even when the offender is caught. Maybe the offender is punished, sent to prison, or even after the encounter. The victim goes through a lot or could go through a lot for many years. They experience emotional trauma. When we talk about reintegration of the victims, we really need to focus on their safety and helping them deal with the trauma of victimization. What about the community responsibility? Most areas have victim advocates, victim support groups, funds to assist the victim. Social workers can be assigned to help the victim. The victim should be offered immediate help and support following any incident. The parallel approach where victims are considered and move away from the offender-oriented justice system is important. They must feel safe before they can begin to heal. All of these needs are identified during the encounter, and they plan in the encounter how to address these issues. And usually it's listed within that agreement. Now we're going to talk about reintegration and offenders. When we're working with offenders, we need to focus on them accepting accountability. Reintegration with offenders is, as we said, can be similar to the victims in that there is a stigma placed on them. They have to accept responsibility for their actions before they can change and re-enter society as productive members. They have to recognize the effects of their crime on others. There are many obstacles. They could be released from incarceration. They have to overcome these obstacles as a result of their crime or other ones before incarceration. And it can be very difficult to do this on their own without any assistance. Personal and community, they return to the same environment that they offended in. Uh, for instance, we talk about Chicago School for Sean Kay. One of the theories is that it's the environment that causes that offending. And if that offender is coming out of incarceration or even being on probation, they're going to return to where they live, where they offended. In society, there could be a lack of positive role models. Their peers could be a lack of positive. There is a stigma that will follow them. They're a convict. Job offers are limited. And depending on the crime, labeling. So are they labeled that it negatively affects them? They also, if they were incarcerated, they could have the institutionalized mentality. Oftentimes, offenders even feel like victims themselves, and they need help, especially immediately following the incident. But they need a different type of, of assistance. They may need psychological testing. When we talk about reintegration, most of the time we're referring to prison reentry, as I said. But offenders in prison enter society many times without any assistance, without any training or treatment or rehabilitation. And some believe this falls on the system and the community to help them. Some say, well, it's their bed, let them lay in it. But we as a society have an obligation to assist in order to protect our community, increase safety, and decrease recidivism. As I said, you put that offender right back in that community without any assistance, what are they going to do? Reintegration has a number of definitions. It can mean reentry into the communities as productive members from prison. It can be reentry into the community as a victim. It's more than tolerance, but it's acceptance of the person and who they are, not what they did or what was done to them. It requires community action to assist either the victim or the offender. It cannot happen alone, it's not immediate, and it takes time. We also, when I talked about this on the last PowerPoint, reintegrative shaming with John Braithwaite is a way to use shame effectively. In a mediation or conference, the offender is told about the ways that he's done wrong and is basically shamed. But we're not talking about embarrassment, as I said before. Then, as the mediation continues, the offender's supporters and family members will tell them how they care about them, how they want them to succeed, and what their offending did to them. They will then bring them back into the community and continue their support. That's where the reintegration comes in. You know, the reintegration, especially through the reintegrative shaming, um, the relationship between the offender and the community must include mutual respect, mutual commitment from both sides, and intolerance for deviant behavior. Now, again, that falls on both, and that's what the integrative shaming does, letting the offender know we're not going to tolerate your behavior anymore, but we're here to help you. There's a difference. Now, we're going to talk more about reintegrative shaming and reintegrative reentry when we talk about prison reentry. Don't worry, we're almost through. Reintegrating communities. This is helping make the communities whole. The ways that communities help to reintegrate are through support and assistance groups for both the victim and the offender. Faith communities, they can help both with assistance, employment, housing and transportation. They are a source of support. They can offer feelings of involvement and acceptance. Judeo-Christian beliefs calls towards this. So using that is a very positive resource for both offenders and victims. And I'm going to finish up really quickly here, as quick as I can. You aren't required to read chapter 7, but I just want to briefly talk about it. And I want to hit the high points. It's about inclusion, and inclusion is allowing the victim access and to be included in all areas of the criminal justice system. As we know, many times the victim is not included in our traditional system. Within the restorative justice, the encounter areas, the conferences, the circles, the VOMs, they're inclusive and they include the victim. Making amends can include the victim or not. The offender can still make amends without involving the victim. But victims should be informed of all areas of the process. They can observe the process. They can make a formal presentation to the court or prosecutor with victim impact statements. And that gives them a feeling of control back, of full participation. Now, this can be hard, but it's also it's important for that victim to feel needed, to feel important. When the prosecutor decides to prosecute, they decide what crime to indict on. The prosecutor represents the state, and therefore the victim usually is not even involved. The prosecutor may and sometimes does involve the victim, but they're usually going to do what's best for the state. The processes involve investigation, arraignment, bail release, plea bargaining, sentencing, post-sentencing release, and usually it doesn't involve the victim, but it should. The victim should be included. And I know I said I would stop, so uh, I'll try to bring this up in class, but just one thing to think about. There was a case that had to do, Jodi Arias. Everybody heard about that case. And they wanted her to get the death penalty. But every time they had to go to court, the family was re-traumatized. Now, that prosecutor did involve the victims and did ask, do you want to go for the death penalty? And they did. But many times, which is important to think about, when we go when the court goes for the death penalty, and if they get the death penalty, they're going to go through 10 years of appeals. And every time they're appealed, you're going to bring that victim's family back in to the court. So they're going to be re-victimized every time. So is that really what they want? So, and many times you'll hear that the family doesn't want to go for the death penalty. They just want them gone. Just put them in jail, and I don't want to ever see them or hear from them again. So, if involving the victim should be important to the state and to the entire process. All right, I'm done. I will do week 3, but I won't do that until next week after we meet. See everybody on Monday.